Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm RJ Turcotte, Nantucket Waterkeeper of the Nantucket Land Council, and I'm very, very happy to welcome you to our third installment of Clean Water Topics on Tap. I'd like to thank first the Nantucket Land Council's Water Fund Founders Circle, whose support of our water fund helps to make these programs possible. For anyone who's not familiar with our work, the Land Council is a nonprofit environmental organization that has been working to protect and preserve Nantucket's natural resources since 1974. We have a strong focus on the island's fragile water resources, from our incredible sole source aquifer to our freshwater ponds, our coastal wetlands, of course, our harbors, and the greater Atlantic Ocean. And we're very interested in promoting good government policies to preserve these resources and educating the community on a variety of local environmental issues. And one of these local environmental issues that the Land Council has taken on over the past 4 or 5 years is the European green crab, which was accidentally brought over here by humans, possibly in ballast water ships, just over a century ago, and they are a voracious and very adaptable crustacean that is wreaking havoc on both coasts of the United States at this point and are very successful and very competitive with our local species. So we've been working to better understand them. The Land Council has already pulled out easily over 1,000 green crabs over the years from both Nantucket and Nantucket harbors as we continue to try to understand where they are, what they're feeding on, and how we can best address the issues. So with that in mind, today's topic on tap is green crabs, danger and delicacy. Now, before I introduce our amazing speaker and presenter this evening, I'd like to just go over some Zoom etiquette and protocol for the Q&A session to follow. And if you have a question, we're going to allow time for questions with myself and Ms. Parks at the end. Please type it beforehand. Really, as soon as you think of a question, type it into the Q&A portion of Zoom, and hopefully we'll have time to get to all of your great questions. So with that, I'm really thrilled to introduce Mary Parks, Executive Director of greencrab.org and co-author of the amazing and beautiful Green Crab Cookbook, to share with us a really creative solution to our invasive crab problem this evening. So take it away, Mary.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, RJ. So I am one of the co-founders of greencrab.org, an organization that is completely dedicated to cooking with invasive green crab and also developing culinary markets for this very, very detrimental invasive species. So today we're going to be making a pretty easy recipe with green crabs. Green crabs, even though they're a really big problem here in the United States, as well as pretty much every single continent outside of their invasive range, they're a very versatile species to cook with. And in their native range, they're used in a wide variety of ways, including in stocks, in sauces, they're served soft shell, they're shucked for their roe. And that's one of the things that we're going to be cooking with today is a green crab stock and making a green crab and mushroom risotto. So for this recipe, we're going to be making a quick stock. I've had this going for about 20 so minutes. And in total, this quick stock takes about an hour. And stock is one of the easiest ways to cook with green crabs because you don't have to do all the manual labor associated with shucking them. And it's something that can come together pretty quickly. And so for this risotto, I'm going to have the stock going the whole time next to the risotto. And to start off, I am just going to start off with sauteing some mushrooms. And one. Cool. And while I'm doing that, I can talk a little bit more about green crabs and their invasive impact. So I will start off by sauteing, this is about half a container of mushrooms and 2 tablespoons of butter. And I'm going to do this before I start off on the risotto or anything else. And again, I have my pot of green crabs right here. And so for the stock, what I've gone ahead and done is I have rinsed off my green crabs well in fresh water and immediately put them into a pot of boiling water. And the reason that you want to put them in a pot of boiling water immediately after you rinse them off well is because they are a saltwater species. And so once they're exposed to fresh water, they are going to get a little bit upset. And so once we rinse them off, we're going to put them straight in the stock pot. Again, these have been on for about 20 minutes. And then I went ahead and I crushed them using a rolling pin right here and crushed them for about 2 minutes. And let me pull a couple of them up just so you can see the consistency as well. If you don't mind zooming in here. So crushing them up until they're essentially, you might have some half claws, but it looks like this. And so I have this 2-layer stock pot right here, which is great because towards the end, I can just lift out the green crabs and then I'll have this big, beautiful container of stock. With the quick stock, one thing that you're going to want to keep in mind is that you're going to want to use a larger ratio of green crabs to water. And so I have green crabs here and then water just up to the level of the green crabs. Okay. And while this gets going, talking a little bit about green crabs and their invasive impact. So this is the right one, right? Yes. So green crabs are one of the world's worst invasive species. They're a huge problem for local shellfish populations. They prey upon soft-shell clams. They also outcompete a lot of local shellfish like crabs and lobsters that they share food sources with. And so one of the reasons that it's so great to eat them is that we can actually mitigate their invasive impact by removing them from the water, eating them, harvesting them, and we can actually do things like help soft-shell clams that are preyed upon by green crabs. Green crabs also are a huge problem for eelgrass, which is nursery habitat for a lot of these shellfish and finfish species that we like to eat. And eelgrass is very much an already vulnerable ecosystem. And so why our organization is all about eating green crabs, as I mentioned before, is that even though they are considered a pest here, and other parts of the world where they're a native species, so they'll be found in their native range anywhere from Northern Europe to North Africa, they are very much considered a culinary delicacy. So they've been on menus in throughout Scandinavia, at Noma. They're used in stocks and sauces in France and Spain, and they're served soft shell in Venice, Italy, mostly, and other parts of Italy. So I'm just going to essentially saute these mushrooms until they start to get a little bit of brownness. I'm using a portobello mushroom right here, which is going to be a little bit more watery. And so I like to put in a little bit of butter with this. But if you're using something like a beach mushroom or an oyster mushroom, you can definitely put it right in the pan to brown. And so I'm going to let this go for a little bit. And one thing I like about this recipe is that your stock can cook simultaneously with the risotto next to it. And so all in all, this can come together in about an hour. And the risotto itself can come together in about a half an hour. Okay. And another thing that is great about this recipe is that you are left over with a lot of stock towards the end. And so you'll have about, depending on the amount of water and green crabs that you cook up, you can have anywhere from 6 to 8 quarts of stock left over at the end, which is great. Now, one of the things that as an organization we're very big on, and one of the ways that we found out about this recipe has been collaborating with a lot of local chefs who have been working with green crabs in the area, trying to develop culinary markets. And the reason that we're so big on developing culinary markets for green crabs is that there currently are markets for green crabs for bait markets. But essentially, these are pretty small markets. They're constrained to seasons like the tautog season and the striped bass season. And essentially, it's a pretty limited and small amount of green crabs that are harvested for a specific purpose, where fishermen aren't necessarily paid what they would be paid for culinary markets. So when we're looking at a fisherman who's able to sell green crabs for bait, they might only be making 50 cents per pound. Whereas culinary markets, for example, in Venice for soft shell crabs, you might have up to 80 euros a kilo. For example, hard-shell crab sold for culinary purposes in New England can make $1 or $2 a pound, which is substantially more than on the bait market. Okay. A little bit on this. After I brown these mushrooms, I am going to start with the risotto. And what I have for ingredients here is I have some thinly sliced onions. I have a cup of arborio rice. I have about a teaspoon to a tablespoon of garlic paste. And then I like to put in some fresh peas at the end or some pea shoots just to add a little burst of freshness, as well as some lemon juice and some lemon zest. And I guess now I could talk a little bit more about the impact of green crabs in the US. So I was mentioning a little bit before about how green crabs are a big issue for local shellfish populations. Their densest populations for green crabs exist in New England, where they've been about 200 years, but they're also becoming increasingly an issue on the West Coast. So they were detected on the West Coast a little over a decade ago, and in some spots they've only been popping up for the first time for the past couple of years. And so there aren't currently markets for green crabs on the West Coast of the US, like there are markets for green crabs on the bait market here. However, it is very much possible that in a few years or a couple decades that could completely change. And it's one of the reasons why early detection and monitoring, like the Nantucket Land Council does, is so important for being able to detect this problem early. One of the reasons green crabs can spread so fast is that a single female green crab can produce up to 185,000 eggs per year, which is really, really scary to think about, because if you have only a couple green crabs, you can soon have a huge green crab problem. And the reason they were able to get over here so successfully is that their larval stages stay suspended in water for a pretty long time. And so they came over to New England about 200 years ago in the ballast of ships. And essentially since then, they have completely taken off. They're going to be one of the most commonly found crab species that you find in New England. And in a lot of regions, they are completely the predominant species. So for example, if you are walking along a beach on the coast of Maine, New Hampshire, and especially the North Shore of Boston, you're probably more likely to see a green crab than you are to see a rock crab or many other local crab species. So I'm just getting these nice and brown. And again, it's great to have the stock going at the same time, not only because you want a hot stock for risotto, but I actually like having this rough sieve that you can pull it out and also directly ladling the stock out of the pot into the risotto, because you're going to get some of that crab fat, and you're also going to get a little bit of meat that's going to come through as well. I developed some color on these mushrooms. Give me a second. And again, stock is a great way to cook with green crabs if you're cooking with them for the first time. I'll show in a few minutes, but green crabs do tend to be a smaller crab species. And so if you're shucking them for meat, it is going to take a bit longer. However, it is possible, and we have those recipes on our website if you're interested. Shucking them for roe is another great way to cook with them, but you definitely have to get in there. I recommend steaming them ahead of time, letting them cool off, and treating it almost like you would treat like a crawfish boil. So getting your friends together, shucking roe together, and then you can make a bunch of different recipes with the green crab roe, such as the demo we did last year. Or you can just eat them directly out of the half shell. So now I'm going to get my onions sauteing a little bit. I slice these pretty thin, just because I don't really want a predominant onion flavor in this dish. More just a little bit in the background. And you can really tell at this point in the stock that the flavor is starting to develop. We're getting a pretty strong crab aroma coming off. And there's so many variations of this dish you could do as well. You could even, in preparing for this, I added a little bit of Parmesan in, which I know for a lot of people, seafood and cheese is a major faux pas, but I actually like this dish because it doesn't taste super crabby. You more get the umami from the crab that adds a little bit of richness to the dish, opposed to it tasting like, for example, a she crab soup or a really strong crab flavor or seafood flavor. My onions caramelize a little. Not letting these totally caramelize, mostly just sauteing them to get a little bit of color. We're only going to have these in here for about 4 to 5 minutes. And as you can see, I don't have a super deep color on my mushrooms, but we're going to put these to the side just because we don't want them to get soggy from the broth. And we're going to put the peas in at the very end, and also the garlic paste in about halfway through. If you want, I'm going to add a little bit of lemon juice at the end to give the dish a little bit of acidity, but you could also swap out some of the stock for white wine. You could add in a little bit of dry vermouth. You could definitely be flexible with this dish. So my next step after I do these onions is going to be to brown the rice a little bit. So I'm actually going to add the rice in just with the onions. And I'm going to toast the rice just until it gets a nice caramel color. This definitely is a dish that you need a little bit of patience on. You don't want to rush it, especially when we get to the phase of ladling some of the stock into the risotto. But again, if you have the stock going for about a half hour beforehand, it shouldn't take you more than 45 minutes. It is also, I'm hesitant saying kid-friendly for any seafood dishes, but I have fed this to a 6-year-old who really, really liked it. So if you have a more open young kid, this is a perfect way to introduce them to a sustainable, yummy local seafood. You notice the crabs are really starting to get a rolling boil, so I'm going to turn it a little bit down to a simmer. So again, this is going to be a quick stock that I'm making, and for this, the strategy is crushing them up as fine as you can with a mallet or a rolling pin, and you're going to have a lower water to crab ratio. So we're just putting the water in until it reaches the crabs, and then we can either lift it out afterwards, or you can actually just label it directly into the rice. So my rice is starting to get a nice caramel color. I'm going to give it a little bit longer. This is really what's going to give the dish color. Yeah, it's an easy dish too if you're cooking with family. To have the kids help out with. Definitely when you're holding crabs and ladling them in, I would recommend just dumping them directly into the stock pot, and definitely being careful when you're picking them up. So once I start adding the stock in, I will show you guys what the green crabs look like, as well as how to handle them safely. But again, my strategy would just be, if you can, dumping them into a stock pot like this. These are great because you can use this while you're rinsing off the crabs well and just put them directly into the stock pot. However, if you don't have a double layered stock pot with a strainer built in, that's totally fine. Okay, so now that my risotto is starting to get some color, I'm gonna give this about 2 more minutes. I actually, when I'm making this dish at home, I use a wok for it, just because it's a really easy way to quickly toast the rice, but you can use a saute pan. I probably wouldn't use a cast iron or something along those lines, but you can definitely be flexible. Another alternative too is you can definitely get creative if you want to. In the past, what I've done is actually cut a green crab in half and put it in there while I'm sauteing the onions to release a little extra flavor. But now we're at the stage where we can start adding in just a little more salt. We can start ladling on our stock. So in total, I have a cup of rice right here, and very slowly, I'm going to add 3 cups of stock. I'm just filtering this out right now. It's going to keep getting more intense as I go. This is roughly a half a cup right here. And constantly stirring this so that the risotto slowly takes on that flavor of the stock. And I'm just doing this until the stock is absorbed. It's really important that the risotto is absorbing the stock fully before you put more of the stock in, because you will end up with a gummy and undercooked risotto, and that's no fun. Nobody wants a hard risotto. Another thing that you could do if you have the stock on hand is just heat it up in a container next to it and slowly add in your risotto that way as well. One great thing about green crab stock as well is it freezes really, really well. So if you have like the whiskey stone tray that is like kind of a bigger way to freeze cubes, that works great. You can also use a takeaway container or another Tupperware container. So my stock, my first half a cup looks like it's absorbed. So I'm going to go ahead and add the second. Also going to turn this down. At this phase, you don't want this on anything higher than medium heat. This total process of adding stock and letting it absorb should take about 20 minutes. And when I'm halfway through this, I'm going to add in my garlic. And then when I'm on the last ladle of stock right here, I'm going to add in a little bit of lemon zest. So if you do have green crab stock on hand, there are tons of other great recipes that you can cook as well. One of my favorites is green crab and clam chowder, which is a great way to combine a species that's impacted by green crabs with green crabs themselves. It tastes really, really similar to a normal clam chowder, but you can use minced clams. You can even completely leave out the clams and just use green crab meat. Again, it is a little bit tougher to shuck green crab meat than for, say, a blue crab. But if you have patience, it's not that bad. I would definitely recommend having a little crab pick tool on hand if you are going to do that. And while this is absorbing, it's fully absorbed. I'll do one more. And then I will show you some of the green crabs that RJ caught. So when I'm not trying to get any of the gills or anything else. I'm just taking essentially the crab fat off of the top. as well as the stock, but you could also, again, if you didn't want to have deal with any of the raw cooking stock at the same time, you could have that going ahead of time. All right, so while that is absorbing, I'll show you some of the green crabs that we are using. So in here we have both male and female green crabs. The male green crabs are going to be a bit bigger. So this is the size, I would say, of a larger male green crab. So you're going to see smaller than a blue crab, but still a pretty decent size. Here, let me hold it over light so you can get a better idea. And you can tell it's a male green crab by looking at the bottom. So right here, you'll see that they have a narrower bottom in comparison to the female crab that I'm about to show you. And an easy way to tell the difference between a male and a female green crab is if you think of female green crabs being more like the Capitol building on the bottom versus the male green crabs being more like the Washington Monument. And so you have this bib where the female is going to hold her eggs, and then here you have essentially a solid piece right here. And this part of the crab is called the apron. Female crabs, again, are a great way if you want to cook with green crab roe. Oh, this went way down. One moment. Definitely always make sure you are washing your hands after touching live green crabs. I think I might need a little help with this lovely stove. Possible? Should be good. Perfect. Thank you, Susan. All right, and now that we're about halfway through, so we have roughly a cup and a half of stock in here right now. And so we're just starting to see some of that velvety goodness of the risotto. Just letting this absorb and heat up a little bit again. But yeah, if you have green crab stock on hand afterwards, again, this is gonna have a couple quarts left over at least. You can freeze it, you can keep it in your fridge for up to 4 to 5 days. And it's a great way just to boost the flavor of a dish and add a little bit of umami, even if you don't want a super strong crab flavor. That's one of the beautiful things about green crab stock that I like so much. And this is starting to absorb, so I'm going to go ahead and add a little more. Now, as an organization, one of the things that we're really, really big on is recipe development. And so we try to create as many recipes as we can that are catered towards home cooks, because we know that sometimes smaller crabs aren't the most approachable species. We also have the Green Crab Cookbook, which I co-authored with Tom Tai, and that essentially is going to step you through the many ways of cooking with green crabs. You can find this on our website, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and a bunch of other places. But essentially, as I was mentioning before, there are 4 main ways to cook with green crabs. That's in stocks and sauces for their roe, soft shell, and then you can also ferment them. And there are a lot of different dishes that have fermented crabs. If you head over to Green Crab Nation's website, you'll find a recipe for fermented crabs there. It's a Korean recipe. It's absolutely delicious, and it's a great way to cook with the whole crab. is slowly starting to absorb. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and add in my garlic paste. You could also, if you wanted to, add in minced garlic or sliced garlic a little bit earlier in the process. I like to add it in about halfway through so you still have that sharpness, but not too sharp. Just keep stirring. You'll see that if you pan in on this pan, you'll see the stock that is clinging to the rice has a lot of that starchiness. It's starting to take shape. I'd say we're about halfway through the process. And another thing to keep in mind is that it's not an exact science. We say 3 cups to 1 cup of rice for this recipe, but depending on how quickly you cook the rice and other conditions, that could definitely vary. If you're adding in wine or a vermouth, I would definitely recommend adding that in halfway through the process or at the beginning of the process so that it has a chance to cook down. And you can see even at this point that we have a lot of little flecks. I'm not sure if you can see in this image, but actually a lot of little flecks of crab meat in there. I'm going to get a nice full one of this while I can without getting in any of the gills or anything. And then I'm probably going to remove the crabs from the stock pot. Okay, so now that we're about 2/3 of the way through, I'm going to just put a little bit of lemon zest in here, just a bit of freshness. The lemon, the crab flavor, the peas, it's a great spring, early summer dish. Don't go too crazy with it, but it's a nice way to add a little punch. It smells so yummy. And if anyone is interested in cooking with green crabs on their own, RJ has volunteered that he is happy to provide green crabs to people who are interested. And if you're ever on the mainland and looking for green crabs, then you can head over to our website and you'll find our buying guide, which has a list of green crab harvesters as well as wholesalers who are selling and working with green crabs. As an organization, another thing that we're trying to focus on more and more has been looking at ways to develop green crab products. So while I think the process of making your own stock and using live green crabs is great, it's definitely not the most accessible to everyone. And so looking towards the future, looking at products that might be, for example, more shelf stable, like broth products, or freezable or frozen, would be a great way to incentivize removing these crabs from the water and also harvesting them at scale. Because right now, current markets for them are pretty small. There are a handful of harvesters who, as I mentioned before, are mostly harvesting for bait purposes. Green crabs make great tautog and striper bait. However, our thought process is, if you can't eat them, beat them. They are a delicious species to eat. So why not take advantage of their culinary potential as well? And another thing that you could do too, if you wanted even more stock, is feel free to add more water to this existing stock pot and let it cook for about 4 hours. You can really let the stock cook for a very long time, or if you're looking to create more of a quick stock like we are today, then you're going to want to have more crabs and cook at a slightly higher temperature. But it's definitely worth it if you have the time to create the 4-hour stock. And if you can just let it go after you're done cooking the dish, then you can have a ton of leftover stock that you can use in a bunch of recipes. So this is really starting to take shape. I have about, I would say, a half a cup to a cup worth of stock left. It's definitely a dish that I would recommend eating immediately after you prepare it. You can definitely, it doesn't make the worst leftovers, but risotto is always best fresh. Now, if you are interested in learning more about green crabs and their invasive impact, be sure to check out our website, greencrab.org, as well. We have a bunch of resources for understanding how specific ecosystems are impacted by green crabs, how you can get involved with monitoring green crabs, if you find one on the beach, and reporting them to various organizations. And also, if you're ever yourself interested in actually harvesting green crabs, it's really easy for a person to become a green crab harvester. All you need is a letter of authorization from the state of Massachusetts and $10. So if you head over or you just look up on Google, green crab letter of authorization Massachusetts, that should be one of the first things to pop up. It's a simple letter of authorization from the state, which essentially just allows them to track who is fishing green crabs and where they're fishing green crabs. But you do not need to be a commercial harvester to harvest them, which is great. And even if you are not a trapper and you're someone at the beach who is just swimming out in the water or you're tide pooling, you'll often be able to find them in tide pools. If you swim out into the water with a snorkel and a net, it's super easy to scoop them up yourself. I used to do that as a little kid as an activity. Make sure you're careful by holding them with their outer points like I was earlier, because they can pinch. But again, they're a super common crab species and not very difficult to find at all. At this point, I'm going to add some freshly cracked pepper. You could definitely get creative with the spices if you'd like. And again, this should work for most risotto recipes, I would say, so feel free to be creative. Right now, pardon, I'm using a very large spoon for this, but I'm just going to check for salt and also the texture of the risotto. It looks like it has a little longer to go. Well seasoned, I would say we have about 5 or 10 minutes, probably closer to 5. Okay, and at this point, I am going to just lift these crabs out of the liquid. Do this on the sink. And you'll see if you pan in that you have this super rich colored stock right here. It's become deeper and deeper as we've been cooking with it. And if you wanted to afterwards, some people do use a sieve to make sure that they're getting out, for example, any of the little bits of meat. However, I like for this recipe meat and also fat, that keeping the fat in there so you get that little bit of extra flavor with the risotto. At this stage, I am going to also add in a little bit of lemon juice to give a bit of acidity. Half a lemon is great. You're going to want to add this in pretty much at the very end, so it still has a chance to absorb, but that you don't lose that sharp acidity. And this creates about 2 to 3 servings. You can very easily double the recipe, but I would not recommend going beyond doubling it because you're going to have rice that's a little bit overcooked and it might take a little bit longer in terms of absorbing. Now, I'm gonna put one more thing of stock through, but essentially what you're looking for texture-wise is that when you move the rice across the pan, that if you could zoom in right here, when you're moving the rice across the pan, is you don't want the sauce next to it to fall out. You want a little bit of moisture, but essentially you want that sauce to be thick. So right now we know that it's not ready. This phase, I'm also going to go ahead and add my mushrooms back in. Another twist for this recipe is if you have a packet of mushrooms, a package, and you wanted to use half of them adding into the risotto, you could take the other half of mushrooms and actually put it in the stock and make a green crab and mushroom stock, which is absolutely delicious. Now I'm going to go ahead, add a little more stock in. And I'll probably just wait until this absorbs, and then we should be about done. I'm gonna add my peas in at this phase as well. I like it when the peas are just barely cooked so they still have their nice green color. I'm using frozen peas for this recipe, but you could use fresh peas. In the recipe that we have online, we have pea shoots, which are absolutely delicious on top, but you could use a lot of different vegetables. Asparagus, broccolini, get creative. And while this is absorbing, you can get a better sense of texture right here. If you look at how fine I mashed up the green crabs, essentially the finer that you mash them with a mallet or a rolling pin, the more flavor you're going to get out of them. Do you have a little spoon? Thank you so much. Then we're just waiting for the last of this stock to absorb. Say we have about 5 more minutes. We wanted to, just looking at time, what we could do is we could also go into the Q&A at this portion as well. Get some questions going.
good to me, Mary. If you're ready for them, we can just jump right into it. Okay, so first question from an audience member is, I love blue crab, but I've never tried green crab. Where can I go to try green crabs prepared by a professional? I've been researching old edible articles, but I can't find them on menus for the restaurants mentioned in the articles.
Yes, so be sure to check out our website this summer. Also, if you join our newsletter, we're always sharing restaurants that are going to be cooking with green crabs. We do have an event coming up in association with Save the Harbor, Save the Bay, where we're going to be bringing green crab education to the beach. We're going to be coming out with a green crab coloring book created by a local graphic designer, Eileen Riestra. And there's also going to be a sculpture series by Carolyn Leuenberg. But in association with that, we're going to have tons of tastings at local Boston restaurants, which is not on Nantucket. But if people are interested, be sure to check out those events. We're hoping to have tastings at least 3 to 4 restaurants. And if anyone knows a restaurant in Nantucket that might be interested in cooking with green crabs, feel free to send them our way, and we can help talk them through processing them and working with them. A great thing about green crabs is that you don't need a ton of them to create, for example, a super rich stock that can be used in a bunch of dishes. And there's also a lot of restaurants that have used them to create more shelf-stable items. So for example, Loyal 9 in Somerville or Cambridge created a green crab Worcestershire sauce, which they had on the menu for months. I think that is no longer the case, but again, be sure to check out our website for updates on tastings.
Okay, awesome. This one, I would like to harvest my own green crabs. How can I get into this or learn to do this? I can partially answer this question for everyone who asks. We go out, the Land Council goes out multiple times a month during the summer months to catch and harvest green crabs. And if you reach out to me, RJ at nantucketlandcouncil.org, I'd love to show you how we do it. We have plenty of crabs and we can show you exactly where we're going and what we're doing. And Mary, I don't know about back on the mainland in your neck of the woods, if there's anyone who would show folks the ropes.
Absolutely. So we have a couple of harvesters that we work with that I'd be happy to put you in touch with. We also have on our blog guides on the best green crab bait to work with, different trap types that are more or less effective for catching green crabs, depending on the volume of what you're fishing or the ecosystem. And if you have any specific questions on catching green crabs or even some good fishing spots, depending on where in the state you're talking about, feel free to reach out to us with any questions. My email is maryparks@greencrab.org. And again, you can also just head over to our website on the contact page.
Amazing. Last one from this viewer. I would like to have a green crab boil. Is this in your cookbook?
Yes. So in our cookbook, we go through all the steps, and also you can find this online on our website, of how to shuck green crabs for roe, as well as how to shuck them for meat. And so one of my favorite ways to cook with them is to have a bunch of green crabs that you steam, lay them out on the table with crab picks, have some people over for drinks and picking green crabs. You can eat them right out of the shell with a little bit of lemon if you're harvesting the roe. You can pick out the meat and dip them in some butter. Another great way to cook with them, if you are looking to really get meat out of them, is to shuck their crab legs first. And you end up with these legs that have this little lollipop of meat on the end. And you can dip that in butter, you can saute, you can grill them. There's a lot of different ways to cook with them. And we also have that recipe on our website as well.
All right, awesome. And this one I'm also interested in. How did you end up as executive director of greencrab.org. And what was your path like? Did you have an environmental background, or were you a cook that saw green crabs being cooked somewhere? Or what's your story, Mary?
Yes, so I am very much a home cook. I am not a professional cook. And my experience with green crabs started because I grew up on the coast of Maine. And this was a crab species that I saw every single time I was getting in the water. My mom was a high school environmental science teacher, and so I did have some awareness of what an invasive species was and what green crabs were. And it wasn't until I started working with them through an old organization, Green Crab R&D, that I learned about this connection to Venetian culinary cuisine, the fact that this one species that we considered invasive and a nuisance was actually a culinary delicacy in regions across the world. And I've been working in the seafood industry, hosting events, and I've always loved cooking and loved developing my own recipes. And so it very much became a passion project of mine. And then greencrab.org I founded last year in 2020, a few months into the pandemic, when we were hosting our Shuck at Home program, which was all about getting home cooks to cook with green crabs. And we learned so much about what some individual cooks struggle with in terms of working with this new and underutilized species, as well as tips for how to cook with green crabs for the first time. And what we did is we had several green crab giveaway events where we essentially gave away free green crabs to the public. And that was so useful for understanding how a home cook is actually dealing with green crabs. That being said, it's also really important to understand how they're doing in the kitchen and how they're also doing on the sales floor of seafood processors and wholesalers. And so through that program, we were also lucky enough to work with distributors such as Red's Best and Wolf's Fish and Berkshire Seafood, who helped distribute those green crabs and also gave us some insight behind some of the conversations that were happening on the sales floor. And one of the things that we hear a lot is that green crabs are a trash species and that they're a bait species. But we hear this because there are existing bait markets for them, and a lot of people just don't know how to cook with them. And so that was so important for us understanding what are some of the conversations actually happening that are preventing this delicious invasive species from taking off. And that was a really roundabout way to answer the question, but my background is in fishery science. And I am very interested in sustainable seafood. I also help run a local oyster CSA program. And so very much my wheelhouse has been, how can we combine these issues within seafood sustainability with practical solutions that people can apply in the kitchen and at the fish market. All right. I think we're in the final stage now. About 2 more minutes. Again, it will depend on the pan that you use and also the heat of the stove. I have a gas stove at home, and I used a wok to develop this recipe. And so that did take a little bit less time than what we're doing now, but we can keep the questions rolling, and this should be good in like 3 minutes.
All right, awesome. Ready for another one. So you mentioned earlier in the presentation that green crabs have really spread on the West Coast over the last 10 years, and folks are curious if anyone over there is catching on and trying to cook with them, or if you've reached out, or...
Yeah, so on the West Coast, people have been finding them, but they have not been able to cook them at volume or harvest them at volume. And so it's very much possible that in the future there could be emerging markets for green crabs. However, at this point, they're more focused on early detection and harvesting them for removal. And so even if, for example, a local organization only finds 4 to 5 green crabs, that could definitely be of concern, with the implication that there could be 185,000 eggs produced by one green crab. All right, and we are all ready pretty much to plate up our risotto. Bowl right here. gorgeous. And here we have it, our green crab and mushroom risotto. Let's turn this off. Any last questions?
Had one more question about a species that we see a little less often here on Nantucket, but is also a problem, Asian shore crabs. Have you ever heard of anyone eating those, or have you ever tried any yourself?
So I have never had the opportunity of trying them myself. However, a lot of people have been cooking with them. Mia Sushi in New Haven, Connecticut, I know has fried them up, especially when they're smaller, and had them on top of their sushi. And I believe you can cook with them in similar ways to green crabs. In terms of being and like the scale of an issue of what they are, they're not as much of a problem in the northeastern United States as a green crab, but that could definitely change in the future.
All right, amazing. Well, that was our last question from the audience. Can't thank you enough, Mary. I have to say you're one of my favorite presenters. It's like watching art. I was out there on the harbor today collecting those crabs, and they were absolute little ornery monsters, and it'll never get old watching you turn them into something beautiful and delicious. So we can't thank you enough for coming out and helping us turn these from a problem into something that we all can enjoy. I'd like to once again thank the Nantucket Land Council's Water Fund Founder Circle, and hope that everyone who tuned in today can join us next month on August 19th for a Clean Water Series talk on coastal plastics and microplastics in our environment. So thank you all.